Josh here, and welcome to this installment of the Rules of the Realm series. In this installment, I'm going to cover a very basic concept of sorcery, the regions of sorcery. Each region in sorcery has particular characteristics that impact how cards interact with those regions. Understanding what happens in each of the regions, what can be done in each of the regions, is one of the most fundamental things that players need to learn when playing sorcery. There are some intricacies that people actually don't think about, and that's going to be most of the focus of this video. But I do want to talk about each region specifically and the basics of it before we dive into some of those other intricacies of the individual regions. So, to start off, there are 4 regions in sorcery. That is it. No more, no less. Those 4 regions are the void, the surface, and 2 subsurface regions, underwater and underground. Now, let's talk about each one of those individually and how things can interact with each of those during the course of a game of sorcery. The first region I want to talk about is the void. And the reason I'm starting with the void is because when you start a game of sorcery, you have a grid with 20 empty squares. Each one of those squares represents a void. So, in the beginning, there is nothing. There is darkness. The voids. Your avatars, well, your avatar and your opponent's avatar are the only things that exist at the start of a game of sorcery. And so the very first thing that you must do is start eliminating those voids by establishing your realm and playing a site. But the voids are very interesting. And there are certain aspects of the void that players can take advantage of. The first thing to know about the void is that no minion can survive in the void unless it has void walk. Without this ability, any minion that somehow finds its way into the void dies. End of story. That's it. To top it off, that minion is actually banished. It doesn't go to your cemetery. If a minion without void walk walks in to the void somehow or gets pulled into it or whatever, and yes, there's a way to pull minions into the void. I know, there's a way. If that happens, the minion is banished. So that's a very important thing to understand. That minion can't come back. You can't get it with Death Speaker. You can't get it with Raise Dead. It is banished. Another important aspect of the void is that unlike a site, which has 2 levels, the surface and a subsurface, the void does not have that. The void is simply the void. There is one level to it. And everything in that void is at the same location. So that is an important thing to understand because some players think that there's like a subsurface or something. There is not. It is one level, and the only things that should really be in the void are minions with void walk and potentially artifacts that perhaps you played to the hands of a particular minion that you had out in the void with void walk. That's another thing that could end up out in the void. And because artifacts are essentially inanimate objects, they don't mind that they're in the void. They simply exist there. Auras also can exist in the void. They're magical things, so they don't care. Now, if you animate one of those auras and it doesn't have void walk, that aura is in trouble. So Make sure if you are out there and one of those players that loves to play Enchantress, if you're animating your auras, make sure no part of them is in the void when you animate them, because otherwise they will be banished. Again, banished. So those are the most important aspects of the void. But the void also has one other very interesting rule tied to it. It has a mandatory action. What's a mandatory action? A mandatory action is something that you must do at the very start of your turn before you can do anything else after the start phase. So you have your start phase, start a turn effects, draw your card, and then as soon as your main phase starts, you must take mandatory actions. You can do nothing else. The mandatory action tied to the void is that if by some chance your avatar has ended up in the void through some happenstance in the game, and there are a few ways, they're very rare, very uncommon, but they can happen, you have a mandatory action. Your avatar must tap and play a site underneath itself. This ignores all site placement rules. So usually when you play a site, it must be attached to your realm, unless all of your sites are destroyed, in which case you can play the site as near to you as possible. But in the case of an avatar truly being in the void, it must tap to play a site. That is a requirement. Now, some of you may be saying, well, what if you don't have any sites in your hand? That's one way to get around this rule. You're not forced to draw a site, so potentially you could remain in the void, but that is the only way that's going to happen, and you've got to get in the void in the first place, which again is very tricky to pull off. So, mandatory action in the void. If your avatar is in the void, they must tap and play a site underneath themselves, removing themselves from the void. And that's it for the void. The most important aspects of it, the things that you need to understand, and some of the little intricacies that you may not have been aware of. So let's move on to the next region. The surface, the place where most of the action happens in a game of sorcery. The surface is the top level of a site. So a site has two levels, surface and subsurface. On the surface, that is where things get done and sorcery really gets played. The most important aspect of the surface is that your minions on the surface can attack the surface of an opponent's site and deal damage that results in a loss of life for their avatar. And that is why, in most cases, the other regions of a game of sorcery just don't see quite as much action. I would say that the void sees probably the second most amount of action, whereas the subsurface levels tend to see limited play in either certain types of decks or with very particular cards like Root Spider, a bane of the underground for any one of you that has played the game regularly. But on the surface, you can attack your opponent's, the surface of their sites, deal damage, and cause a loss of life. Now, there's one thing about the surface that I think really confuses newer players. Well, what about minions with airborne? They're in the air. So there are certain effects, right, that shouldn't affect a minion that's in the air on the surface. I mean, it's not going to get hit by a rolling boulder. Look, it's a big boulder. It's a really big boulder. Yes, it is. Because there are only 4 regions in sorcery. The air is not a 5th region. Anything on the surface is on the surface. And if something deals damage to all the units on the surface of a site, everything takes that damage. And yeah, sometimes it doesn't quite make some sense. Why is my Pegasus getting hit by Blaze? Someone ran by and left a trail of fire. Why are they taking damage there in the sky? Well, you know, it was a big blazing wall. They were being a bit lazy hanging out, and they took the damage. So you do have to suspend your belief a little bit. But then again, we're playing a fantasy game, so come on, get with it, everybody. But that is the key thing about the surface. If something is on the surface and has airborne, it's on the surface. It will be impacted by anything that happens to anything on the surface of the site that it's at. So be aware of that, and that will help you clarify some of the things in the rules. You're like, oh, okay, now I get it. That is one of the most important things about the surface. And other than that, that's really it for the surface. You're going to be there a lot. Most of your minions are going to be there. Most of the activity of the game is going to happen on the surface. So, remember, the air isn't another region. It's just on the surface. And definitely make sure that you are attacking the surface of your opponent's site to make sure that they are losing life so that you can win the game. And now, let's move on to the last regions of sorcery. Underground, one of the two subsurfaces of sorcery. If a site does not have water threshold, then it is a land site, and its subsurface is underground. Water being absent is what makes this whole determination. If the site does not have water threshold, then the subsurface is underground. So what's special about the underground subsurface? Well, for minions to exist there and survive, they must have burrowing. If a minion finds itself underground and it doesn't have burrowing, it dies and goes to the cemetery. So one of the most popular cards in sorcery is Earthquake, because that effect allows you to bury things at 4 sites, allowing you to clear the board, reset the board in a small way. Hopefully, if you're behind, it helps you catch back up. Or it could be the thing that seals your opponent's fate so that you can deal that death blow and end the game. So that's pretty much it for the underground. You just got to have burrowing. There is one more thing, though. In addition to the burrowing that a minion must have, what about artifacts? Artifacts can exist underground, just like the void. They are inanimate objects. It doesn't matter that they're underground. They don't care about it unless they're an automaton. An automaton that is also a minion will die because it does not have burrowing. Now, let's move on to the final region of sorcery. The final region of sorcery, my personal favorite, underwater. So, any site that has water threshold is a water site, which makes its subsurface underwater. Very similar to underground, minions cannot exist underwater unless they have the keyword ability submerge. Any minion that is able to submerge and go underwater can exist there without any issues. Also, just like underground, an artifact that is not an automaton can exist underwater and not be impacted. Inanimate objects don't care about being in water. And that's it. But the key thing to remember is, if a site has water threshold, it is underwater. This can be very important for certain effects in sorcery. For example, if your opponent has a pesky little root spider, a good way to get rid of that root spider is to flood the site that it is at. Flooding a site gives it water threshold and immediately turns the underground area into underwater, which will kill that pesky root spider. So that is the very interesting thing about water and using the effects of certain cards that allow you to flood sites, which will allow you to eliminate certain underground minions that may be causing you problems. Root spider being the most common, but there can also be other things that are problematic. Perhaps your opponent has a cave troll that is coming after your root spider. Oh, and you can flood where the cave troll is at, and then it's no longer a problem and your root spider can move along and do what it needs to do. So, using those flood effects can be very helpful, but just know that if a site has water threshold or gains water threshold, then the underside will become underwater. And if anything happens to be hanging out underneath with burrowing and it doesn't have submerge, it's gone. So those are the 4 regions of sorcery: the void, the surface, and the 2 subsurfaces, underground and underwater. If you take anything away from this video, it should be that there are only 4 regions in sorcery. The air is not a region. Anything that is airborne and on the top of a site is simply on the surface. So remember that. 4 regions: void, surface, underground, underwater. And that will help you understand the interactions that you can engage in while playing sorcery and how certain cards will impact those regions. That concludes this installment of the Rules of the Realm series. I hope you enjoyed this particular topic, and if not, hopefully a future topic will be something more to your liking and you will gain some knowledge about sorcery that you did not know about in that future installment. Other than that, we're done for today. So, as always, keep on contesting the realm!